Andrew, you've had a very full and distinguished life as a writer. I would say a writer in very different fields and genres: crime novels, psychological thrillers, plays, screenplays, what used to be called Christian apologetics, and now political writings, commentary, analysis, debate. Probably there are other forms of writing I don't know about, because you also write under pseudonyms as well as under your own name. So my first question should be, how on earth do you find the time? But the first question really is, how did you start? You went to Berkeley College in San Francisco. What then?
Well, it was the only thing I ever wanted to be. The only thing I ever wanted to be was a novelist. It was my ambition. After I got over wanting to be like a cowboy, that was really my earliest ambition. And so when I left, everything I did after I left college was just to support myself while I wrote novels. And I was a newspaper reporter. I was a radio writer. I worked as a reader in for a movie studio where I just read books. And all the while, I would just write novels, and they wouldn't get published, and I would write them again. I write another one, and I kind of worked very hard to perfect what I was doing. And finally, I sold a small young novel for a very small amount of money. And I thought, well, my life is made. I'm set up for life. And I quit my job as a newspaperman and went starved for the next 5 years. And very slowly made my way back into print. And then after that, I was kind of set free.
I'm going to cover all of these bases, I hope. But let me start with the political. I imagine you didn't start out as a conservative. Not many people do. I know you lived in London for a while, apparently not when Mrs. Thatcher was actually running things, but shortly after she had fallen from power. So you were living under Thatcherism, even if you weren't living under Thatcher. Did Thatcher and Thatcherism have any impact on your political opinions? And how do you see the lady now?
Oh, well, certainly I would say the triad of Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope had a definite influence on my opinions. I couldn't help but notice that everything they said turned out to be true. And I was brought up, and the press taught me to regard Ronald Reagan as a wild cowboy who was going to bring us all into nuclear war. Thatcher, the same way. And yet I had visited England before Thatcher, when it was a very, very depressing place, really mired in the 1950s in an old economy. And Thatcher completely revived it. And I remember the transition that I made from being a knee-jerk liberal who didn't really agree with liberalism, but just knew that conservatives were evil. That was the only thing I knew. It took place in England, because when I lived in England, I lived there for 7 years in the 90s, I was away from American politics and had a chance to think for myself and just sort of observe things for myself. And one thing I remember is talking to a very popular friend of mine who was a very popular novelist. She wrote those sex and shopping novels. And I remember she always referred to Thatcher as, I'll call it the witch. She would just say, the witch, that witch, that way. And I finally said to her one day, I was here before Thatcher. Didn't she really save this country from extinction? And she said, yes, but she was still a witch. And that very much summed up to me the left's idea of politics. The policies didn't matter. The right and wrong of it didn't matter. All that mattered was adhering to a certain virtue signaling attitude and philosophy that didn't really work. And so after I saw the Berlin Wall fall down, that was a big shock. I mean, that I never expected to see that happen. And I remember what I said when I saw that was, man, that old coot, referring to Reagan, that old coot was right about everything, And so that really started me on this kind of transition where I started just listening. Once I started listening to conservatives and thinking, well, maybe they're not evil. Maybe they have something to say. That was the slippery slope. I was doomed from that point on.
No, it is a slippery slope. But on Mrs. Thatcher still, because you're a successful Hollywood scriptwriter, what did you think of the Meryl Streep movie about her, The Iron Lady?
I have to be honest with you and tell you, I could not finish it. I didn't trust them from the beginning to do a good job. I mean, Hollywood is just so tendentious in its representation of political figures especially. And when they started in on her having dementia, I just didn't want to watch it. I just thought, like, why not show what this woman really did, which was remarkable. I mean, the transformation of the British economy and outlook before Thatcherism, in the same way as Reagan was here, it was just almost miraculous. And so I just didn't want to watch what Hollywood was doing. So I won't comment on the film because I only saw a few minutes of it and thought, I'm not going to watch this. You know.
Okay, well, I'm going to slightly disagree with you because I think your analysis of what the film's intentions were is absolutely accurate. But the performance of Meryl Streep was such a powerful one, both as an old lady, but also in the scenes of Mrs. Thatcher in her middle-aged prime, sort of surging through Parliament with a lot of timid men being dragged in her wake, like Boadicea dragging them behind a chariot. I think that was such a powerful performance that it frustrated the intentions of the film. And you came out, and I know friends of mine who work for Margaret Thatcher felt this strongly, weeping and also tremendously enthused. Anyway, that's my take.
That happens very frequently, especially in American television, where they'll introduce a conservative character as the villain, and he will almost always become the hero to Americans, and they either have to destroy him or transform him or rewrite him to keep people from liking him.
Archie Bunker, for example. Yeah. Now, politics and religion are both journeys rather than destinations. My guess is, well, you've confirmed half of it, that you became what's known as a Reagan conservative, defined as you wish, and now it's fair to say that you are a Trump Republican. If so, do you see much difference between the two men, and if so, what is it?
Well, there's much that is similar about their circumstances, but yes, there's a lot that is different between the two men. They're both products of culture, and Reagan was a product of a better culture. He was a product of a more elegant culture, a more stately culture. He was able to speak very clearly, very eloquently. He was a reader, he was not, he was not a scholar, but he understood the ideas that he was putting forward, and he understood the ideas that he was fronting for. Donald Trump is much more of a gut politician, and he was produced by a lower culture. People on the left attack him for the way he talks and the things he says, but he got that from leftist culture. It's not the conservatives who destroyed culture in America, it's the left, and he is a product of that culture. He grew up, in TV, being a TV figure, and so he's a product of leftist culture. And that's very off-putting to me. I mean, I don't like the way that he's rude and he bullies people. However, the thing about Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan entered a still functioning American society. Now our institutions have been virtually gutted. Our legislature doesn't pass laws. Our bureaucracy does pass laws. Our Supreme Court passes laws. The president has become almost king-like in his ability to throw out executive orders and to decree that he's not going to enforce laws that were rightly passed. In order to break through that system, which we call the deep state now, it's the deep state, this kind of unelected bureaucracy that seems to run the country counter to the Constitution. To break through that, it really took an extraordinary, rude, and bullish man, and that is what Donald Trump is. And fortunately, we are blessed by two things. One is that his instincts are very good, and his political instincts are very good, and the other is that the left won't deal with him and have forced him to the right. So Donald Trump, who was all his life was a Democrat, still has some liberal tendencies, has been forced to basically do the right thing. And because he is a man of courage and because he is a belligerent guy, he has done more in many ways than Reagan ever could. I mean, Reagan lamented the fact that he was unable to make the government smaller. Trump has cut regulations in an amazing way. His move of the embassy to Jerusalem in Israel, which has now paid off in an astounding Israeli peace deal. The speeches he's made, a speech he just made yesterday about restoring American patriotism to our educational system, are stunning. I mean, they're stunning things to say in this day and age. So Trump, in some ways, he's a great big American figure with great big American flaws, but he is coming into a china shop where all the glass is already broken, and we need somebody to tear down the shop itself, and he has done a fairly good job of that, and if he gets reelected, I hope he'll do even more. So I support him in what he's doing. He sometimes, I don't know a Trump supporter who isn't sometimes driven crazy by his outlandish tweets and his outlandish behavior. However, he really does have good instincts, and he has been forced into philosophical conservatism by a completely intractable left.
Well, I was going to ask you what you would say to European opinion, which is more or less uniformly hostile. One or two exceptions. In Hungary, he's quite popular, but everywhere else, even among the right-wingers, they don't like him. But I think I was going to ask you what your argument about him would be to them, but you've just said it. So I'll move on to another point, which is what's just happened in the Middle East, as you mentioned. Now, reads to me, as it obviously does to you, as an amazing achievement. Not the end of everything, but a very large step to the end of everything. And I wonder if you would speculate on why the Democrats have given such an unwarm welcome to it, and what impact do you think this will have on the coming election campaign?
Well, I think it is a good thing for Trump in the election campaign, and that, of course, has inspired the Democrats to try to find some way to at least ignore it, if not attack it. But there's more than that. What Trump did and what Jared Kushner did was a direct repudiation of every single thing that Barack Obama did. And in fact, it was made possible by Barack Obama's immense incompetence in the Middle East. I mean, this is the thing nobody talks about with Obama. He was graceful, he was well-spoken, he was this and that. But not only was he corrupt in many ways, he was incredibly incompetent. And he was incompetent because he insisted that he understood the world when he clearly didn't. And one of the things that he did, of course, was bolster Iran with this bogus Iranian nuclear deal and also the money that he piped into Iran. And I guess the theory, what they say is that the theory was that he thought if he was nice to Iran, Iran would move into the community of nations, this imaginary thing that takes place in leftist mind. But like so much that the left does, because they blame the West for everything, they don't take into account that people act out of their own motivations and their own beliefs. Iran is a terrorist country because the people who run Iran are terrorists. They have a terrorist philosophy and they have terrorist intentions. They're not about to become part of the community of nations because they don't agree. That's not their philosophy. So what Trump and Kushner did essentially was they went in to this morass, which has depended for all this time on Palestinians accepting a peace deal. But the same thing is true of Palestinians. The Palestinian goal is to eradicate Israel. And so every time we went in for a negotiation, they would say, well, that's a nice offer, but it doesn't eradicate Israel. And then we'd go back to Israel and say, well, could you eradicate yourself a little more? And the Israelis were always supposed to give something up. Instead, Trump and Kushner went in and said, look, the Palestinians are never going to accept anything but the destruction of this country. So how about making a deal for your own benefit? And they even took actions to prove it. They offered the Palestinians a lot of good deals, and the Palestinians turned them down. And they said, if the Palestinians are going to say no forever, is that a reason for you to not benefit from trading with the most successful country in the Middle East, namely Israel? And because they were afraid of Iran and because they want to make friends with Iran's enemies, they actually came to the table. And now they're talking about even Saudi Arabia coming to the table, in which case we're going to all have to learn how to say holy smokes in Hebrew, because, I mean, that would be an amazing breakthrough. So all of this repudiates the philosophy of the left. The New York Times did a wonderfully hilarious, begrudging editorial where they begrudgingly said that, yes, this was a nice achievement for the Orange Man bad, but Middle East peace is supposed to mean peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So in other words, it wasn't good because it actually rejected the failed philosophy of the left. And this is the wonderful thing. I don't think they're going to change their minds. I don't think the left is going to change its failed philosophy. They never have. They never do. But it is an amazing achievement, and maybe somebody in the State Department, even after Trump is gone, maybe somebody in the State Department will start to scratch his head and say, this is a good, bold new strategy.
Well, perhaps it's the case, as I think people like Eli Kadurian for many years argued that you couldn't have a peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians until the rest of the Arab world had made it plain it wasn't prepared to carry on supporting Palestinian rejectionism, so to speak. Now, my next question is also about religion. It's my last one, really, about Trump. He's been accused of cynically using religion for political purposes. I think, for example, when he walked across from the White House to the church, the Episcopalian bishop whose church that was, accused him in the strongest terms of, in a way, almost sacrilege, holding a Bible. When he was making a political case against what she said Christ would have done. Can you talk about the significance of that moment for a moment? And also perhaps speculate on what Trump's actual relationship to religion is, because he said some remarkable and sometimes very odd things about it.
Well, the photo op outside of the church, to accuse a politician of having a photo op is hilarious. It's like accusing a politician of being a politician. But what was really remarkable about that photo op was after weeks and weeks and weeks of the left appeasing rioters and saying, oh, these riots are mostly peaceful, or the wonderful Chiron on CNN, a mostly peaceful riot intensifies into arson, something like that. I'm quoting from memory. But to see Trump come striding out, looking like a cowboy in an old movie, come striding out of the White House and walk across that church, so unmanned them that they had to basically bring the press together as one and say, oh, this was a terrible thing. It wasn't a terrible thing. It was a perfectly good photo op. And it actually represented his determination to save a church, which is a classic monument in Washington, and was burned down. It was burned down. So he was standing up for something that had been vandalized. His relationship to religion and to the Christian religion is a troublesome one in certain ways. No one would call Donald Trump's life a Christian life. When he was actually running for president, I called him the first post-Christian president because all of his attitudes about wealth, about success, about belittling people who were less successful than him were anti-Christian. There were things that no one even pretending to be a Christian would do. But again, because he was so rejected by the left, because there was nowhere for him to go to the left, and because he needed the evangelical right, he turned to them and with his usual boldness and courage and decisiveness has defended religious principles more strongly even than an actual religious person like George W. Bush. That, like other things, he has a gut feeling for God, that there is a God, that there is some moral order. I do believe that. I do believe that he is not. I do believe that he's not a man without some kind of moral compass in him, and that he senses that these guys are talking about all this Jesus stuff or talking about something important and real. But the evangelicals have made a very biblical decision, which is that not every man chosen by God to do good is in himself a model of Christian piety. And that's true in the Bible with from King David to, the king who restored the Jews to Israel after the Babylonian exile. It's true throughout the biblical stories that God chooses flawed, difficult people to do the work that he wants them to do. And they feel that way about Donald Trump. He has been a vociferous defender of the unborn. He has been a true defender of the faith. Whether he, in fact, believes or even understands the faith, I don't even want to speculate, but I would say, given his life, no, this is not St. Donald descending to help the faith. This is a politician who is doing something very good in spite of the life he's lived.
I've sometimes wondered, Andrew, whether or not God made Donald Trump president in order to save his soul. But I'd like to turn to your conversion. You converted and you wrote a book about your conversion. It's a big deal to convert, and it's not everybody stays converted, and it creates problems for them with those near them, those near and dear to them. What about your conversion? Has it, so to speak, stuck?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. My life, every day, I would say, I hate to sound pious in any way, but I mean, it just is speaking the plain truth every day. Christ becomes more and more the center of my life. Mine was a very long journey because I was born a Jew. I was a secular Jew in a very secular world. I worked in publishing in New York and in movies in Hollywood. I have been in everybody I knew was at the default setting of secular life. And I had to make a genuine transition that was difficult. It was difficult for my family. It was difficult for my friends. Made my life more difficult in Hollywood to some degree. But, I was just reflecting, funnily enough, yesterday about the fact that 3 weeks, I converted, I was baptized at 49, so I was baptized late in life. 3 weeks after I converted, my beloved wife, who knows me better than anybody, turned to me and said, "You're a completely different person. You have completely changed for the better." And so it was an onrush of joy and serenity that has only deepened ever since, even through the natural grief and trials of life that we all go through. It has sustained and maintained me. And I will say that I have developed more and more trouble with organized forms of religion as I have become more religious, as I've become more attached to Christ. I still believe that you have to go to church and you have to gather with others to worship, but a lot of the kind of some of the things that have hardened in the church, I think, take you away from the explosively loving and forgiving and opening words of Jesus, which are sort of have become my northern star. But it's very much at the center of my life.
Good. When T.S. Eliot was converted to Christianity, he became, like you, an Anglican. George Orwell, writing about this, said this was a bit like being converted to communism and becoming a Trotskyist. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, that was very prescient of Orwell, because the Episcopal Church has now been ice-picked by the far left, so I think that was a very accurate description. I entered the Episcopal Church, which is very close to the Catholic Church. My theology is very close to Catholicism, and it has dissolved into leftist nonsense. And the last time I was in an Episcopal church, which was a high Episcopal church, so it very much was very close to Catholicism, the priest gave a sermon on how Jesus died on the cross to help the little boy who is not allowed into the girls' restroom because of our binary prejudice about sexuality. And I thought, I just want a biblical citation. I said, I'll be right behind you with that belief. If you can give me one citation from the gospel, from scripture that says that that's why Jesus died on the cross. And so it just became so nonsensical that it was really hard to listen to it. I love the liturgy, which is, again, a Catholic liturgy. I love the liturgy. The liturgy continues to speak to me. But recently I've been going to a sort of a Presbyterian church, which is much more kind of an American Protestantism, where it's a kind of feel-good Protestantism, which doesn't really fit with my theology, but does bring me into contact with other worshipers, which I think is the important thing.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to ask now about how your conversion has affected your writing as a writer of crime novels and thrillers. I once had dinner with P.D. James, the distinguished English critic and writer, and also a Christian. And she was asked, did Christianity influence her crime novels? She gave an interesting reply. She said, not in the characters, the main characters, not in if they're heroes or villains, not there. But she always had a peripheral character who every now and then would deliver some Christian insight on the workings of the plot and the murder and its consequences. Would you say anything like that about your own crime writing?
It's funny, when I write in my memoir, The Great Good Thing, I write about one of my great fears about converting was that I would turn into a Christian writer. And I literally prayed, please, Lord, whatever happens, don't turn me into a Christian writer. And the reason for that is, at least here in America, Christian art has become what Schopenhauer called banal optimism. It's just this kind of happy talk nonsense where everything goes right for Christians and everything goes wrong for non-believers, and it solves all your problems and all this stuff. And I was terrified that would happen to me. Instead, what it gave me was a far, far more realistic view of the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of humanity. And I found the great advantage of Christianity is that it's true. And as I believe one of the Catholic encyclicals says that you can deduce God from nature. And so you only have to write the world realistically, which I actually believe was Shakespeare's strategy. You only have to write the world realistically to put forward a Christian worldview. And so I've tried to stick to that. After I wrote my memoir, which summed up my thought up to that moment, I went into a period where I could not write a novel because of these very problems. I couldn't figure out how to convey the world as I now saw it, which was a much bigger vision and not a materialist vision, in the materialist medium of the novel. This, I had a breakthrough when I was kind of given an inspiration to write a semi-fantasy novel, a novel that was half fantasy and half thriller novels. And that has opened me up and allowed me to return to the world of crime writing now. Just as all I think I have now is a moral vision. But until I found Christ, all my stories were essentially about how do you know there's any such thing as truth? And all my heroes were always involved in these conspiracies and spent the entire novel going, am I involved in a conspiracy? Or am I just going insane, you know? And after that, I was done with that. After finding Christ, I was done with that, and then started writing novels really about, now that you know there is truth, how do you find it and how do you live? And that, I think, is just a very rich vein. And I don't necessarily include Christian characters. I sometimes do and sometimes don't. But I always include this view of the world as a broken place with a redemptive path to be had through suffering. And so I think that's a difference. You know?
Well, I would say that C.S. Lewis's novels are certainly not feel-good novels, but Screwtape Letters is actually a frightening book, as frightening, I think, as anything you've written. And I want to look briefly, though, at a screenplay of yours that is certainly also a dark one. And that's the trial and conviction of Kermit Gosnell, who performed an enormous number of abortions in unhygienic and illegal conditions, but who seemed immune from prosecution. Now, that movie was essentially factual, but it overcame great obstacles to being made and being shown. But you wrote it in a certain way, and I want you to describe what you did, because it's not the kind of Christian film most people would have made, and it's not the kind of film that almost anybody except yourself would have made, because you brought certain experiences to it.
Well, it's funny because the producers, who really deserve a lot of credit for overcoming all the obstacles of funding it and getting distribution for it, they put out online somewhere that they were looking to raise money to do this film. And I wrote to them and I said, you know, a very talented crime writer, maybe you should check in and see if he'd like to write the screenplay. And we had one lunch together, and they brought me on because I wanted to tell it as a crime story. And when we went to Philadelphia to research it, among the people that we talked to was this cop who was the guy who really broke the case. And he was a devout Catholic, and he was a great guy. And the story that he told was a crime story. That's what it was. And at the same time, the reason the producers were inspired to write it is Phelan McAleer, one of the producers, was in town, and he went to the trial of Gosnell, who was the most prolific serial killer in American history. But nobody stopped him because he was an abortionist, and they didn't want to put abortion in a bad light. So Phelan went to the trial, and there was nobody in the press booth. There was nobody in the press seats covering the trial of the most prolific serial killer in American history. And so he said, gee, this is a good story, just the fact that the press didn't cover this. And so I took it on because I'm really interested in our corrupt press, and because I'm a crime writer, and that is the way I approached it. Before I started writing, when the terrific political cartoonist Michael Ramirez heard I was writing it, he sent me a copy of a Gosnell cartoon he had done, which showed the babies whom Gosnell had murdered as Holocaust prisoners, as people little children in Auschwitz, basically, and looking out through the fence. And I hung that up on the wall behind me. And I was very, very aware that these children, the spirits of these children, were looking over my shoulders, and I had a deep responsibility to get this right. I had nightmares almost every night I was writing the script. It was a very difficult experience just to go into the horror of it without making it a horror movie, because who wants to go to a movie about that? This was something we were all of us very aware of. Who wants to say on Saturday night to your girlfriend, hey, honey, let's go out and, to the movie about the abortionist serial killer? So I took it from the point of view of the cops. I'm a really good procedural mystery writer, and I just took it from that point of view, how they pulled a string. They thought this guy was a drug dealer, that he was selling drugs, and they pulled this string and they walked into his place, and suddenly they thought, what is this place? Because he was living in this nightmare of abuse. Mostly, he was a black man, mostly abusing black patients. The white patients who came to him had a much better, cleaner facility to go to, and he treated them much better. So he was a racist on top of everything else. And he was a spectacular character because he was absolutely Looney Tunes. He was like a Hannibal Lecter crazy man. And yet nobody would pay attention to him for decades, because they did not want to bring abortion into disrepute. And one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and I can praise it because I took it right out of the transcript of the trial, was when the the prosecution brought on a good abortionist, a quote unquote good abortionist, to talk about all the things that Gosnell didn't do that were against her procedures. And the defense stood up and just got her to admit that basically Gosnell did everything that they did, that there was really no difference between the killings that he committed and the killings that abortionists commit every day. And that scene blows people away, and I wish I could take credit for it, but it really was right there in the transcript.
As a matter of fact, when I wrote about the movie, that was one of the two scenes that I singled out. But the other one was the scene in which the political operatives basically say, look, we're not touching any of this because it's too delicate, too sensitive. And so the crimes just went on. I think I would like to now turn to what you're doing today. You're a full-time commentator. You show with a show 5 days a week. You discuss the crimes, the follies, the illusions of mankind, as Juvenal or Gibbon might have put it. My name for your kind of broadcasting is Samizdat Broadcasting, because it looks around at everything and tells the truth, because you're financed directly by your viewers and so on. Now, when you do look around now at the cowardice, at the rioting in the streets and the cowardice of the elites in the boardrooms and the institutions of America, in the face of cancellation culture and the spread of censorship by big tech, among others, do you see America ceasing to be the kind of America we've known and admired, or is it becoming a different country under a different constitution and inhabited in a way by different kinds of people? Will the America of 1776 surf over these problems as it has always done before, or is it in some way permanently on the path to becoming somewhere else?
Oh boy, it's a troubling question. I mean, I'm troubled constantly by the kind of, ancient Greek idea of a cycle of regimes where democracy devolves into chaos, which then devolves into tyranny. I'm troubled by what I know about the fall of the Roman Republic. I mean, a lot of people, it's not just me, have been comparing this to the time of the Gracchi, when the people when the system got more and more democratic, which was not what America was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a republic, a democratically run republic, but not a pure democracy. And it gets more and more democratic, and things start to get more and more chaotic. And I'm troubled. I'm worried. I have to say, I'm a very optimistic, upbeat human being, which is odd for a conservative. Most conservatives are not. And yet I am very troubled. I think that the worst thing that has happened to us is the corruption of our press. Our media, our news media, is wholly and completely and entirely dishonest in ways that were not always true. It's always been biased, it's always been a little bit leftist, but now it is completely dishonest. It's propping up Joe Biden, a man who can barely put an English sentence together, a corrupt man, a dishonest man, and a stupid man all his life, and now barely a sentient man. And they're propping him up and hiding his handicaps. They obviously have gone after Donald Trump hammer and tongs. I don't mind them going after a powerful person at hammer and tongs, but this is after 8 years of treating Barack Obama like the second coming of Christ, while he virtually dismantled the Middle East and kept his foot on the neck of our economy for 8 years. And so it's the dishonesty of the press is really, really disturbing. That said, all of that said, all the things that we see and the violence that you mentioned and the corporations kowtowing to things like Black Lives Matter, a Marxist terrorist group with a very clever name, this idea that somehow there is systemic racism in America, which is simply untrue, and that the police hunt down black people, which is also provably untrue. All of these ideas spreading out into the culture are very, very troubling. Here's what gives me hope. Like the invention of the printing press, the invention of the internet, and computers has truly democratized communication in a positive way. It means that in the same way that the printing press brought the gospel to ordinary people, it means that people like me, artists like me, commentators like Ben Shapiro, can still get the message out to a number of people. The college kids call us the intellectual dark web. And I've met a lot of college kids who went to school as leftists, who were indoctrinated as leftists, and then one day were watching YouTube and saw Jordan Peterson and saw me and saw Ben Shapiro and all these different people and started to say, you know what, here is a new idea, something that really we can cling to. So I think there's hope. I think on paper there shouldn't be hope, but a number of times in my life I have seen things come to the very brink of destruction. I saw New York in the 70s when it was a hellhole like it's becoming again now. Rudy Giuliani turned it around. They called him a racist every single day, and he turned New York into the most peaceful, great city in the world. I saw the Carter years when they said basically the West was trying to commit suicide. I saw Ronald Reagan come out of nowhere and turn that around in ways that they said couldn't be done. So even in these moments of distress, and this is a moment of distress, I see the possibility that Trump could win another term, that he could push forward some reforms that would really put us back on track, and that he could be followed by somebody who maybe has a more philosophical grasp of the principles that Trump is feeling his way toward by instinct. And so I see that hope, and I hope we do it. I mean, I know that history is against us. I know that the communications industry is against us. I know that Europe is against us. And yet there has always been, as you say, this kind of little heavenly spark in America where people at the last minute turn around and turn back. And so I'm clinging to that hope, and I don't think it's an impossible hope.
Andrew, I'm not going to let you finish on such an optimistic, forward-looking note. I'm going to ask you what I think is a natural question for you. You are a successful fantasy novelist, among other things. The two greatest dystopian novels, I think, in the English language in the last 100 years were George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. What's your next fantasy novel about? Maybe you can give us the title as well.
Actually, you know, I wrote that fantasy novel. I wrote a fantasy trilogy called Another Kingdom. And I wrote that because it came to me, it broke through a difficulty I had after my conversion. But my real desire is to return to very basic mystery writing. That's what I really have a desire to do, to go back to the very beginning and reimagine the mystery story from my new point of view. And so that's really what I'm working on. I have written a number of fantasies. I think that the wave of the future in storytelling, and now I've been saying this for 15 years, is now it's almost the wave of the present, but are very, very reality-based, very strongly reality-based stories with an element of science fiction in them that shades over into fantasy. We're moving into a world that is going to get very complex technologically. We're moving into what they call transhumanism, where you'll have things implanted in your head that make you smarter, faster, who knows what else. And I think that that's the story that people are going to begin to tell. It's no longer going to be stories about who killed whom. It's going to be stories that really the mystery is, what is a human being? This started with Blade Runner back in the day, a long time ago, but now Blade Runner is becoming a genre unto itself. And so what I think I'm going to start doing is, I've just finished a new mystery story, which is kind of an old-fashioned mystery story, but I think I'm going to move into stories that are basically very much set in reality, but just have a turn of the screw that takes them into the world of fantastic science fiction that I think we're about to enter anyway. So it is reality.
Well, I look forward very much to reading it and to catching up on the ones I haven't read. Andrew, thank you for giving us so generously of your time. I look forward to meeting you again soon. All the best.
It's always great to see you, John. Thanks a lot.